Built to inspire, inspire it did. In less than 5 months, nearly 4 million people passed through its gates. They blinked, shielded their eyes, as if they couldn't believe such magnificence was real. Made by man, punctuated by nature, full of grandeur, beauty. It stood for possibility, possibility for a young city, for an up-and-coming nation. This is 1909. And this is the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition. Seattle's forgotten World's Fair. AYPE's official purpose: commemorate the 1897 Klondike Gold Rush and highlight Seattle as the gateway to the Pacific. The fair was held in the year 1909, from June 1st to October 16th on the University of Washington campus. Cost to enter: adults 50 cents, children 25. More than 3.7 million people attend, triple Washington State's population at the time. Visitors wore their Sunday best, entered with a sense of awe. Beauty was the intention here. This white city gleams.
Stepping onto the fairgrounds must have been stepping into a brand new world. And people felt they kind of got transported to a different time and a different place.
It was the closest that they would ever get to travel to Athens or Paris or New York or Rome. And that for them, it was the experience of a lifetime.
Fairgoers walked among cascading waterfalls, carefully landscaped grounds, sculptures. They took in distinctly local views. Renowned landscape architect John C. Olmsted considered it his most beautiful fair.
The magnificent views will, however, be by far the greatest features of the exposition and will be vividly remembered by most visitors. John C. Olmsted.
Dazzling buildings on the outside, inside art. Cutting-edge technology. Natural resources. Hundreds sip tea in the Japanese tea house. Music from across America and around the world fill the air. There are amusements, sideshow attractions. Ethnic groups are transported in from across the globe. The Philippines, Alaska, Egypt, people on exhibit. Such displays today strike of insensitivity, of skewed anthropology. Promoters of the time were unblinking. The AYPE exposition spanned 250 acres, included more than 80 buildings. Fairgoers watched reenactments of historic battles, participated in celebrations. Seattle's fair looked to the future. It reached west across the Pacific, stretched north to Alaska and Canada, aimed to increase America's influence through trade. It was a good time to meet at the fair. The Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition began with one man. In 1905, Godfrey Cheelander has an idea: an Alaskan trade exposition held in Seattle. Cheelander is an Alaska gold rush pioneer, and an unapologetic Alaska promoter.
I saw hundreds of people who had come to Alaska with empty pockets but were now well-to-do. I saw the most succulent vegetables. I saw banks heaped full of yellow gold. I saw great ships laden with salmon. Such a country and such a people. Godfrey Chilander.
Chilander envisioned a festival that highlighted Alaskan resources and promoted Seattle as the gateway to the north. The idea struck a chord. Seattle's Arctic Club liked it. Local newspapers supported it. Businessmen took over the idea and formed an exposition company. The group named prominent Seattle merchant and banker John Edward Chilberg president.
Chilberg was someone who was well respected in the community. He was really the glue that held the whole through line of the fair together.
Chilberg expands the fair's scope. It will be a grand World's Fair, like St. Louis and Chicago before it. It will be international. It will highlight trade possibilities in the Pacific as well as up north. Chilberg and his fellow civic leaders also decide to delay the exposition for 2 years. Instead of 1907, it will open in 1909. AYPE was originally meant to commemorate the major event thus far in Seattle's history, the Klondike Gold Rush.
The gold rush is beginning in 1897, 1898, and continuing to roll for more than a decade. Seattle is the best-placed, far northwesternmost port at the end of a transcontinental railway where would-be miners can outfit themselves, have a good time, buy their steamship tickets, all of the ways that Seattle, as it said, mined the miners.
Seattle in 1909 was leaving behind its frontier past and entering a kind of progressive, mature urban phase. It's kind of rambunctious and unruly and very, very youthful. And things like public schools are just getting established, and the university is just beginning to get substantial enrollments, and it really is a tremendous era of growth.
A 10-year anniversary became part of a 12-year celebration.
And this actually was beneficial in a lot of ways. One, it gave them 2 more years to really plan this out. And most importantly, in 1907, there was actually a slight economic depression. By 1909, the economy had become more robust, and to their benefit, that allowed more people to come out and visit this fair.
And AYPE organizers raised an impressive amount of money, $10 million. That's $192 million today. Who contributed? The everyday citizen gave first and freely. AYPE organizers had an initial capital stock offering. Seattleites bought $650,000 worth of shares in just one day. The state chips in $1 million. The federal government, exhibitors, local banks, railroads, and various individuals round out the contributions.
The people in this town at that time were very excited to have a World's Fair in their city. This wasn't the work of just 5 or 6 or a dozen individuals. This was the work of the entire region.
The other thing that doesn't always come through in the general understanding of the fair was that while the executive committee of the AYPE were all men, these were men who had families that were incredibly involved in the fair.
The fair's location, crucial. The exposition promoted Seattle. Its site must showcase the region's beauty. University of Washington history professor Edmund S. Meany had the answer: the university's campus.
The World's Fair could be an opportunity for the university to get at one fell swoop an enormous investment in new buildings and new landscaping.
The problem: the campus at the time was far from downtown. Consisted of 5 buildings and a forest, and was designated dry.
People were pointing out at the time that this could potentially be detrimental. By law, you were not allowed to serve alcohol within a certain radius of that campus. That's how most World's Fairs made their money, was selling beer and wine.
Meany saw a possibility. The campus, a streetcar ride away. The trees, an attraction for visitors. A dry fair, the world's first.
Meany's just a tireless booster for the city and the university. He's the person who kind of brings together the politicians, the business interests, and the campus to make the World's Fair take place at the University of Washington.
All went well until a few months before AYPE opened. The fair was at risk of closing before it even opened.
So you see headlines in the Seattle Times, and it was meant to shame the wealthy in Seattle to supporting the World's Fair. Its importance is almost beyond stating.
It worked. The fair opened right on time in 1909. At precisely 12:30 p.m., AYPE Exposition President John Edward Chilberg ceremoniously presses a telegraph key. The key sends a signal to President William Howard Taft, a continent away in the White House. The Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition is set to open. The president, in turn, presses his telegraph key and officially opens the fair. 80,000 people cheer. The fair's exposition committee exhale. They have done it. Opened a world-class fair in a city tucked away far from the East Coast, far from California. Look at the number of people. It gave them hope. Hope that this World's Fair just might be a success. Beauty defined this era. The idea, beautiful surroundings ensure a beautiful, functional society. To that end, AYPE's Board of Trustees hired the Olmsteds, the Massachusetts landscape architecture firm. Its job? Turn the wooded South Campus into the most beautiful fair the world has ever seen. The firm had experience, having designed Chicago's World Fair, Portland's World Fair, New York's Central Park, to name a few.
John C. Olmsted was very eager to take on this project because it would be an opportunity to demonstrate what could be done in a city like Seattle and developing an outdoor space with the background of the mountains and lakes, the waterways and forests.
Olmsted kind of pushes for more beauty, and it adds a dimension to planning and design of the city that just had not been there before. So it's really a crucial addition to the city to have the Olmsteds come.
Olmsted designs vistas and circles to highlight Seattle's natural beauty.
You've got a hill kind of sloping down with Mount Rainier in the distance. So that's where they designed the Court of Honor with the buildings around it as the centerpiece of the fair. So when you stood there, you saw this lush landscape in front of you and this gorgeous mountain off in the distance.
It becomes the center of your experience. People just oohed and awed about that. It was a grand way to orient the fair.
Around the vistas, Olmsted lays out buildings, boulevards, paths. He incorporates formal gardens with quiet trails. AYPE gardeners plant more than 2 million plants and trees.
Olmsted calls for no gaudy displays. He wants the flower beds to be simple and harmonious with the magnificent natural surroundings. James Frederick Dawson, Olmsted Brothers firm.
People like to sit in the center part of the fairgrounds and feel the breeze that came up off of the water and enjoy it.
The Olmsted brothers probably gave us the most long-lasting and the largest legacy of the AYPE, and that was the grounds themselves. Because you can look at the University of Washington today and still see that footprint of the 1909 World's Fair.
They stood with a look of permanence. Grand, gleaming, Most were elaborate facades, palaces made to fall.
These buildings would have very lightweight interior frames. Those would hold walls that were just plaster held together with straw. So from the outside, the buildings looked very permanent, when in fact they were really meant only to last a year.
AYPE's chief architect, John Galen Howard. The style, neoclassical.
So the centers of the World's Fairs, beginning in 1893 in Chicago, tended to be these clusters of pavilions drawing on the classical style, because those were more monumental and drew upon the heritage of Greece and Rome and then the Renaissance, and that was felt to be an appropriate character.
The fair's centerpiece, the government building.
This was your chance to see the Smithsonian. So it was filled to the brim with all of this American history.
Information today is at our fingertips. In 1909, life was much more isolated.
You had to go really looking for that educational experience and finding it in books and finding it in magazines, whereas at the fair, it came to you.
The technological advancements during this time would change the world. People came to fairs to see these modern marvels.
One of the machines that's on display at the World's Fair is a Seattle invention. That's a salmon butchering machine.
Intended to displace human beings in eviscerating fish and taking off their heads and tails and fins and cut them up into steaks. A very basic kind of industry. And the higher edge kind of technology that, for instance, the Dubilier transmitter represents, this sort of BlackBerry of its time, which was 2.5 feet on a side in an oak case that could transmit a wireless message 30 miles. That was brand new, as were the airplanes that were just beginning to be displayed.
Place yourself at the time. Air travel was very new. The Wright brothers had only flown a few years before. The fair promoters wanted to have something there to excite people about air travel.
AYPE hired J.C. Bud Mars to fly his dirigible around the fairgrounds.
It was kind of a slipshot, this device that he had. When you look at a close-up of his craft, there wasn't even a seat. He just straddled this metal device and just puttered around.
Opening day, Mars tried and failed to get the gas-powered airship off the ground. He nearly dunked it a few days later in Lake Union.
At the last moment, he crash-landed it on a barge and saved the craft.
Finally, he tried to fly the dirigible low down the pay streak. It impaled on a flagpole, lands hard. Mars suffered minor injuries.
I just wanted to give people their money's worth. Bud Mars.
AYPE ended his contract soon after. Mass electricity was just beginning to shine during this era.
Now, lighting was very important for the commercial success of the fair.
It was all lighted at night. And this is at a time when street lights are still pretty primitive. But the campus was lit all the way till midnight, and that really created a very special atmosphere.
I think at night is when the fair came into its own as a dreamscape. 100,000 lights in a place that was so dark for most people. It turned into a place of real dreams.
One of the goals of the university and the state in holding the AYPE on the University of Washington campus was that it would provide certain permanent buildings that could be used by the campus after the fair was over.
The auditorium, the Fine Arts Palace, Machinery Hall, and the power plant all stand today in one form or another.
The lease also provided that the university could claim as many of the temporary buildings that had been built on the campus as they wanted. And in fact, the university claimed more than 20 other structures that continued to be used, some of them up until the 1930s.
The largest of these, the forestry building.
Forestry building was lovely, and it was built of wood. And after the fair, the university tried holding on to it for a while because it was such a marvelous building. And it actually lasted up until 1930.
The Hoo Hoo House, built by the Hoo Hoo, a lumberman's fraternity that still exists today. The group has an affinity for black cats and the number 9.
It had these black cat cutouts that were outside of it. It had black cats inside of it that roamed around, 9 of them. It was given to the University of Washington and served as the faculty club for many, many years.
The California building, Spanish mission style. It hosted a life-size elephant made out of walnuts, an almond cow, a bear made out of raisins.
California was more experienced with World's Fairs. They had been to quite a few, so their exhibitry was quite a bit flashier and quite more complex than what you'd see in a lot of the other buildings.
The Japan building, painted red, stood in a grove of fir trees.
Inside the Japan building, they showed a lot of military power, they showed a lot of industrial strength, ability to combine the traditional beauty with the modern industrial approach.
The Alaska building housed examples of Alaska's vast resources. Native artwork, gold.
They had a huge display case in the building that was filled with gold. They had gold bars, it had gold nuggets, it had gold ingots, it had gold dust. Each night, this case would descend into the ground, and there was a vault underneath the building.
It was almost like taking a trip to a lot of different places to go through the fair and see what had been pulled together for you to enjoy and learn from.
People saved their egg money, their butter money. They put money aside for weeks in order to go and enjoy the fair because it was their one chance to see great art, to look at great architecture, to hear great music, to feel like they had had a world experience.
One of the aspects of the AYPE and many expositions at the time was something that is off-putting or very strange to modern sensibility, which is the idea of human display.
Every World's Fair in the last 20 years before Seattle had had these kinds of exhibits there. And they conformed to a kind of pseudo-scientific understanding of racial hierarchy. Whites at the top of this hierarchy, and then there were gradations on the way down as some anthropologists at the time understood it, and it was very much racially organized.
It was part of the imperial colonization of the world. And by putting on display the so-called primitive cultures from these exotic places and showing how they could be educated to become like the civilized countries, then the country could show why their colonization was beneficial to the world.
One group that performed in fair after fair, the Igorots, a small hill tribe from the Philippines.
On the pay streak at AYPE, which was the carnivalesque space where Native people were on display, they would actually come in and erect their own village, and the Igorot men would do different war dances. Women would weave.
The Igorot villagers were marketed very salaciously. Headhunters, dog eaters, these were things that were printed in the newspaper as a marketing device for them. I don't have the sense that the performances that the Igorot were giving were salacious in any way, but they were marketed salaciously. That is really not deniable. They had a private manager. They were also compensated for their performance financially.
That's one way of looking at it. It's an exploitation, it's a racial discrimination. It's quite ugly indeed. But then on the other hand, these Igorots
They came here at their free will, and they kept coming back again and again after cities after cities. So you have to ask the question, why they wanted to come back again. This is an opportunity for them to see the world, opportunity for them to build up a different kind of career or professional interest. So I think there are different ways of looking at it.
Not far from the Igorot village, another popular pay streak attraction, the Eskimo village. The Inuits here constructed native crafts, demonstrated Inuit games, wore sealskin, and posed in front of igloos made of plaster and canvas. One of the Inuit women was crowned the fair's carnival queen.
One of the main performers in the Eskimo village was a 16-year-old young woman named Columbia Inutsiak, known as Miss Columbia, born at the World's Fair in Chicago and had performed with her family in Eskimo villages all her life up until that time.
Her mother was very much a stage mother. She was an entrepreneur. She marketed the Eskimo identity and the Eskimo experience as educational and as entertainment. And her daughter, Miss Columbia, was beautiful. And she did attract a following at the fair.
She was very personable. She was interviewed in the press. She met all the VIPs. She was funny. She had a Brooklyn accent. So that put a less exotic face on that part of the fair.
Even while being put on display in this demeaning fashion, people who are actually participants in the displays, they have their own way of claiming the fair for themselves, of making money, shopping at the fair, asserting their own interests in often subtle ways that defy how they're being portrayed as well. It's one of those things that's kind of surprising, where people want people to stay inside certain categories, stay inside certain boundaries, and they refuse to stay there.
The baby incubator exhibit also was a phenomenon of this era of expositions. So it went from fair to fair to fair to fair. The origins of it were in the work of French pediatricians who had found 25 years previously that you could create an environment that would sustain life among premature babies. Prematurity at this time is 6 to 7 months gestation. It's not anything like we would mean prematurity today.
Most of the babies, foundlings, some were adopted after they graduated from the incubator.
The attitudes toward children's rights are very different in 1909 than they are today. And I think nothing makes that clearer than not just the baby incubator, but the baby giveaway.
On Exhibitors' Day, every exhibit at the fair gave away something. An apple, soap. A local children's home decided to offer up a 1-month-old baby boy at the fair.
We believe we ought to take some part in the giveaway celebration. So we told the authorities we would give away a baby, one of 6 we have to be adopted. I hope the person who has the right ticket can take the baby with propriety and can fulfill their requirements. L.J. Covington, Washington Children's Home Society.
People who came through the gate, they had their tickets, and you didn't know what your prize was until you sort of matched yourself up. There was a winning ticket. There has to have been, because someone won everything on Exhibitors' Day. But the person never claimed the baby. 100 years ago is 100 years ago, and it seems very familiar in some ways, but it's a very strange place. Very, very strange indeed.
Included in the name, Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition, emphasized in the logo, Seattle's AYPE aimed to highlight the city's trade with Asia, and most notably Japan, and expand on it.
Seattle had established pretty good trade relations with the Japanese and wanted to use the fair as a way to sort of strengthen those relations. So it goes out of the way at the World's Fair to invite Japan as an official participant, to welcome the Japanese fleet in Puget Sound during the fair, and actually try to treat Japan fairly well, even though there's a lot of competition and fear of Japanese immigrants among a lot of people on the West Coast.
You have to look at where Japan and America's relations were at that time. Japan had basically just beaten the Russians in a war. America looked at Japan as like, this is a growing world's power. So there was some concern of, how big are they going to grow? At the same time, there's kind of an open arms policy of trade. So Japan came here, they moored 2 of their ships down in Elliott Bay. They were actually 2 Russian ships that were salvaged and turned into Japanese naval ships. People were very excited to see this, and they were very happy to have the Japanese up at the fairgrounds.
But it was often a different experience for people of Japanese descent living in the region at the time.
Some whites had begun to see the Japanese as a threat, and there was some agitation against the Japanese. They were seen as competitors, both as workers and as businessmen, and whites didn't like the competition. But many civic leaders of Seattle did not want any activity at the fair to insult the Japanese.
Japan Day was well attended by Japanese Americans. Several thousand came from all over the West Coast and Canada.
The Japanese community was so proud to be supported by their own government and yet to be seen as Japanese Americans.
The local Japanese and Japanese businesses sponsored many of the floats. Total money contributed, $10,000.
The people of Japanese descent who have been threatened, who are mistreated by whites in many ways, use the fair as an opportunity to sort of bask in the glow of the positive attention paid to the country of Japan.
It's an opportunity to make money, to build up goodwill. So I think it was a good time for them, and I'm sure they had fun too.
An event like a World's Fair, it's a sprawling enterprise, and it takes on a life of its own. The city fathers had a very specific agenda tied to their class and gender and race. But once the fair gets going, many other groups are able to take advantage of it for their own agendas.
Every day, except Sunday, was designated a special day at AYPE.
World's Fairs are like a kaleidoscope. The organizers of the fair had a day to celebrate pretty much every group, every activity, every cause imaginable.
Groups typically gave out ribbons, pennants, something to commemorate their day. More special days are added as the fair goes on.
The special days were a marketing ploy to encourage attendance at the fair. Almost every day of the fair had one special event assigned to it, and sometimes 4 and 5.
There was Japanese Navy Day, China Day, Children of All Nations Day. Seattle Day drew the largest crowd, 118,000. Imagine a 60-foot replica Viking ship docking at the fairgrounds. Norway Day celebrated the largest immigrant group in Seattle at the time.
What we see happening with Scandinavian, specifically Norwegian heritage, the pride that was wrapped up in that, is very indicative of the Norway Day.
On New England Day, the Mayflower sailed toward AYPE under full sail.
It was very crude, didn't have all the details on it, but it was basically a ship with 3 masts with sails, and this acted as the Mayflower on New England Day. It came in, the pilgrims got off, they were all dressed up.
The first week of July was one of AYPE's biggest weeks. It celebrated the women's suffrage movement. In 1909, Washington women didn't have the vote.
By the time the fair took place, the state legislature had scheduled a referendum on women's suffrage for the following year. Activists took advantage of this opportunity to sort of have a national convention of suffrage at the fair, and also to promote to the people around the state of Washington the idea of suffrage for the following year.
A train, the suffrage special, picked delegates up along the way. It rolled into Seattle to kick off the festivities.
These are women that are traveling with corsets on and huge hats, and they have to come all the way out to the West Coast to rally the vote, and rally the vote not among women, but among men.
On board include Lucy Anthony, Susan B. Anthony's niece, Pauline Steinem, Gloria Steinem's grandmother, and the Reverend Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, minister and physician.
It's their job to convince men that they need to have the vote, that they're not just a bunch of uppity women that are going to take away your right to drink, but that they really can contribute to society in a powerful way.
There's no doubt in my mind but that the suffrage conventions at the fair during 1909, which were heavily publicized and aired out in the media of 1909, really made it clear that women deserved the vote, that they were articulate about political matters, that they had the right to vote on their own future and on the way that their families lived.
November 1910. Washington women received the right to vote. Only the fifth state to do so. Another 10 years will pass before the 19th Amendment grants all American women the right to vote. September 30th, Taft Day at AYPE. Huge crowds welcome President William Howard Taft.
This was a big deal to have President Taft out here. It's not like these days where you just hop on a plane and go to any city he wants.
Taft raced from exhibit to exhibit, eager to see all he can.
A lot of the exhibitors were giving him things, you know, here's a bushel of apples from Wenatchee, or here's a pin from our community, things of that nature.
Taft panned for gold in the Alaska building. He came up dry. Someone slipped him 2 gold nuggets anyway.
The Washington state is important to Pacific trade. Seattle itself embodies the power of the people and the possibilities of development in the Northwest. William Howard Taft.
Taft had a great time out here. He went golfing afterwards.
The man Taft ran against in 1908 comes to AYPE days later, William Jennings Bryan. Black educator and activist Booker T. Washington was scheduled to come to AYPE. His schedule kept him away. His wife, Margaret, and son came in his place. Olympic-style sporting events were held on the south end of the fairground, as well as a big stockyard and poultry show, the largest the West has ever seen. 18 buildings, each 50 feet wide, 700 cattle, 350 pigs, 300 horses, and 1 pony raffled off.
People bought tickets for this pony. Well, it was won by an 8-year-old girl. Every little girl's dream is to have their pony. That was her special day at the fair.
AYPE is remembered for a long time. People forget some of the details. They forget the contributions. They forget the labor unrest, the racism. They forget the divisions over suffrage. But they remember the kind of celebration, the kind of happy time.
The emergency hospital was constantly being used by people who had headaches, people who felt faint, certainly workers on the fairgrounds who injured themselves in various ways.
Deaths occurred at the fair.
There was one death of a girl visiting the fair. She was walking along and just passed out and died, 18 years old.
A special day performer was accidentally shot.
Redmen were a fraternal order. They put on a mock cowboy and Indian battle in the stadium. Well, during this battle, they were using guns that had blanks in them. Guns with blanks are dangerous because they're still firing off a blank cartridge. Well, someone during this battle got shot in the groin at close range and fell down.
And everyone thought, oh, he's pretending to be dead. Well, in fact, when the show was over, he was bleeding and they took him to the emergency hospital on the grounds of the fair, and he died there.
And so that was one of the tragic accidents at the fair.
Tragedy again struck AYPE. On September 25th, a streetcar jumped the tracks outside the fair's gate. The accident injured 55 people. 1 Tacoma man died. July. AYPE's high water usage causes the rest of Seattle to run dry. Exposition officials begin pumping in Lake Washington water to irrigate the fair.
They were using water from Lake Washington to water the flowers, which is fine.
It worked, until the Lake Washington water line broke. Workers went in to fix it. They accidentally reattached the drinking water line to the Lake Washington water line.
Lake Washington, at that point, all the sewage went out into the lake. There was no kind of cleanliness involved with that lake water whatsoever. And that's what people were drinking on the fairgrounds for probably only a couple of weeks, but that was enough.
Typhoid sickened more than 500 people. 61 died, including 20 tourists. The incident marked Seattle's last major typhoid outbreak.
In general, it was a pretty safe fair. Many people felt that that was because it was a dry fair. So since people were not being sold alcohol, maybe they were on their best behavior. Many fairgoers who had been to other expositions commented on the fact that weather here was so pleasing, that the fair was so beautiful, and that the grounds were slightly smaller than some of the other fairs, so they didn't just feel completely worn out when they had gone through the fair here in Seattle.
Closing ceremonies, October 16, 1909. 15,000 people are on hand, including AYPE's president, J.E. Chilberg.
I approach this duty with some feeling on my part, for there is something of sadness to realize that a bane of duty and pleasure should come to a close. The fair is at an end. John E. Chilberg.
The Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition is over. Much of the fair came down faster than it went up. People packed up, moved on with their lives.
I think that also actually says something about why the fair has been somewhat forgotten, is because the founders of the fair, the people that experienced it, they were so focused on the next best thing that they were always looking forward rather than looking back.
The Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition made Seattle a richer place to live. It made money, unusual for a World's Fair, but AYPE's legacies go way beyond financial.
The biggest legacy was the University of Washington campus. The grounds are still as they were in 1909. When you're standing on Red Square looking down that vista towards Mount Rainier, that was designed that way for the 1909 fair. The same thing with the boulevards, the way they ring out from the center. That was how Olmsted designed it.
What doesn't stop is the level of engineering that takes place to transform the physical city. The city continued to get transformed by the regrades. In the next decade, a ship canal is completed, which lowers Lake Washington and creates a waterway between Puget Sound and Lake Union and Lake Washington. Roads get constructed, and the city increasingly adapts to the automobile and to buses and trucks, which really alter how people get around. The park system gets built more and more. People continue to work on the harbor. They continue to straighten the Duwamish River.
It seems to me that one of the great legacies of the fair in terms of the Pacific Rim trade is the creation of the Port of Seattle. I think that that outgrowth of the fair, with the many, many visits of trade delegations, the situation of consuls, furthered trade ties in a way that really is kind of undeniable.
I think AYPE was important for the city of Seattle because it showed this city that they could pull something of major, certainly national and global importance off.
This was the first big event that they had put on the world stage, a planned event that showed that the entire community, the entire state, could work together. Every county participated in this. All these different organizations participated in this to make this fair successful And I think the people in this area walked away from that feeling very proud about that.
It was a complicated effort that required tremendous planning and sequencing. It was done on a shoestring, and this place pulled it off. And that in itself is a remarkable accomplishment. Seattle never looked back in so many ways.
The fair, built to be remembered, has largely been forgotten. It remains today. Look closely. Relics, reminders, glimpses into the past. AYPE brought grandeur. Defined a city. Inspired a community. It believed in what Seattle would become.